There are some mysteries that just never, ever go away. And more than 100 years after one of the most brutal and infamous double murders in American history, there's one name that can still send a chill down your spine: Lizzie Borden. Now, she was actually acquitted in a court of law, but the mystery of what really happened on that hot August day back in 1892, well, that's never been solved. To even begin to understand the legend, you have to start with the rhyme that made her a household name.
You've probably heard that right. This simple, incredibly gruesome little rhyme basically cemented the whole legend. Kids sang it on playgrounds all across America, and it became the official shorthand for the entire grisly case. But, like a lot of legends, the story it tells isn't exactly the truth. And right here, we see the first huge gap between the myth and the grim reality. The truth was, well, less poetic, but somehow even more horrific. Abby Borden, Lizzie's stepmother, wasn't hit 40 times. It was closer to 20 times with a hatchet. Her father, Andrew, suffered 11 blows. The rhyme inflated the numbers for sure, but it could never really exaggerate the sheer brutality of what happened.
So let's go back. Let's go back to that day. We are in Fall River, Massachusetts. It's an industrial mill town. The date is Thursday, August 4th, 1892. And inside the Borden house on 2nd Street, a series of events is about to kick off that will become a true American obsession.
Okay, look at this timeline. It is incredibly tight, almost claustrophobic. Just before 9 a.m., the men of the house are gone. Sometime in the next hour and a half, Abby Borden is killed, upstairs. Her husband, Andrew, gets back home around 10:30, and just 30 minutes later, he's murdered while he's napping on the sofa. Then, at 11:10, it's Lizzie who cries out that her father is dead. This whole gruesome affair took place in less than 2 hours, inside a locked house with only a handful of people around. For the investigators, the question was immediate: who else could have possibly done this?
To even begin to understand what happened, you have to look past the crime scene and into the family itself. You know, on the surface, they seemed respectable, pretty well off. But underneath all that, the Borden house was basically a pressure cooker of resentment and tension just waiting to explode. And this number is right at the heart of the whole Borden family paradox. Andrew Borden was incredibly wealthy. We're talking over $10 million in today's money. But he was famously, almost pathologically cheap. Their family home, which was in a pretty affluent area, didn't even have indoor plumbing. That miserly lifestyle was a huge, constant source of friction.
And you can see here, it was a long list of simmering tensions. There were just so many potential motives for murder, all boiling under one roof. Lizzie and her sister Emma, they deeply resented their stepmother. They actually called her Mrs. Borden to her face. They were furious when their dad started giving property to Abby's side of the family. And get this, just days before the murders, the entire household gets violently ill, and Abby was terrified they'd all been poisoned. This was not a happy home. All right, so with this shocking double murder on their hands, the Fall River police get to work. But from the very start, the investigation was, let's just say, a little shaky. It was hampered by some weird oversights and, most importantly, a main suspect whose story just kept changing.
From the second the police arrived, Lizzie's behavior just struck them as off. You'd expect someone who just found their father's mutilated body to be hysterical, right? Grief-stricken, but they found her strangely, almost unnaturally calm. That lack of emotion immediately put her on their radar. And then her alibi started to crumble. At first, she told police she was out in the barn loft for a while, looking for fishing sinkers. But later, at the official inquest, she gave these rambling, conflicting stories about being in the kitchen or maybe the dining room. Her timelines didn't match up, her stories just didn't add up, and that pretty much solidified her as the #1 suspect. So, down in the basement, investigators found what they thought was the murder weapon, a hatchet head with a broken handle. But what made it so suspicious was this fresh coating of ash all over it. It looked like someone had deliberately dipped it in ash to make it look old and dusty, like a really clumsy attempt to hide it in plain sight. And then you have this moment. This is just damning. A few days after the murders, a friend who was staying with the sisters sees Lizzie just calmly tearing up a dress, getting ready to burn it in the kitchen stove.
And her excuse? She said it was stained with paint. The prosecution would later argue that she wasn't destroying a paint-stained dress. She was destroying the blood-spattered proof of her guilt.
So, Lizzie Borden was arrested and indicted, which set the stage for one of the most sensational trials in American history. I mean, the entire nation was captivated. The press descended on Massachusetts to cover every single shocking detail. And it's really hard to overstate how fascinated the public was. Think of the biggest trials of the 20th century, the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, the O.J. Simpson case. This was that level of media circus, but back in 1893. Every single newspaper in the country was covering it. And believe me, everyone in America had an opinion. So the prosecution presented a strong case, but it was all circumstantial. They had the shifting alibis, the burned dress, the suspicious hatchet, but the defense, they were brilliant. They just masterfully poked holes in every single piece of evidence. They argued, hey, you can't prove that hatchet was the weapon, and really hammered home the point that for such a bloody crime, not a single drop of blood was found on Lizzie or her clothes. The judge even threw out testimony about her trying to buy poison days earlier. And then, in a moment of pure courtroom drama, when the victim's actual skulls were presented as evidence, Lizzie fainted. You can bet that swayed the all-male jury. And you know what? It worked. The defense totally succeeded in creating reasonable doubt. On June 20th, 1893, after deliberating for just 90 minutes, an hour and a half, the jury came back with a verdict: not guilty on all counts. Lizzie Borden was a free woman. As she was leaving the courthouse, she told reporters she was the happiest woman in the world. But that happiness, well, it turned out to be pretty short-lived. The verdict of the court was one thing. The verdict of her community was going to be something else entirely. So even though she was legally innocent, Lizzie would spend the rest of her life condemned by public opinion. She was free, but she would never, ever escape the shadow of August 4th, 1892. Her life after the trial was just this wild study in contrasts. On one hand, she and her sister inherited their father's massive fortune. Lizzie, who now insisted on being called Lizbeth, bought this huge mansion in the fanciest part of town. But on the other hand, she was a total pariah. The high society of Fall River completely shunned her. Eventually, she and her sister grew apart, and Lizzie died a very wealthy but deeply lonely outcast. And because the case was never officially solved, the theories have just been swirling for over a century. Could Lizzie have done it in a fugue state? A kind of temporary amnesia where she wouldn't even remember her own violent actions? What about her Uncle John? His alibi was considered almost too perfect. Some people even suspect her sister Emma, or point to these wilder theories about a secret illegitimate son or a discovered love affair. The speculation has just never stopped.
So in the end, we're left with this question. A jury of her peers said she was not guilty. But the rhyme, the legend, and over 130 years of public suspicion have delivered a very different verdict. The case is this chilling reminder that sometimes the truth of what really happens behind closed doors is just lost to history forever.